To quote from the book, "You know you're an adult when you can't sum up your life on just one date. The same is true of this book. It's far too rich, far too nuanced to be summed up in a single conversation." It put me to mind of not other works of memoir, actually, but rather such novels as William Boyd's Any Human Heart, and the Patrick Melrose novels by Edward St. Aubyn. Rarely do memoirs require a second reading, but if only to appreciate the high level of craft I will be complete merits it. One becomes convinced reading it that this is in fact one's own life. It is evoked that vividly, that intimately. The story, plainly put, is about a small boy growing into adolescence, growing into a young man, bumping his way through life. There's love and sorrow, there's college life and marginal employment, there's confusion and there's clarity, there are even bits of the supernatural. So, before we start our conversation, Glenn, would you please, if you wouldn't mind, reading from the book?
I was lucky enough to record the audiobook, and I asked to stand, and they said, "Wow, it's very professional." So I moved back to San Francisco. I've moved frequently in my life back and forth from San Francisco to Southern California, and the last time I was going to move back into San Francisco around late 2014, I was walking around and trying to figure out what part of the city I wanted to live in. And I came into City Lights on one foggy night, and the clerk behind the counter was talking to a tourist, and the tourist was asking for a book. And the clerk said, "I'm sorry, we don't have that. It's too popular." I thought, I'm moving right here. So I did. I was living on Telegraph Hill when I wrote this book. I want to thank, I see so many people out here who I know, and I'm very, very happy to see you all. And I'm incredibly nervous, more so than I usually am when reading. This is my first reading in 9 years solo, and the last time I read solo, 6 people came. And it's really, really nice to fill up the room, especially with a couple extra people here. The book is dedicated, so the book is in 3 volumes under one cover. It's a triplex book. And this is one of the only opportunities we can have where there's multiple people who were very, very important to the making of the book. And my friend Jason Roberts is here. 1/3 of the book is dedicated to him. Owen Bly is here, and 1/3 of the book is dedicated to him. But those guys, that's just parts of the book. The whole thing, the whole shebang, is dedicated to my love, Sarah Shea. And I'm going to read to you from the beginning of the book. And is the microphone okay? Is it feeding back or anything? Are we good? Okay. Very beginning of the book. A note on the accuracy of the text. My mother assures me none of this happened. I think you're an adult when you can no longer tell your life story over the course of a first date. I might have gotten this idea from my parents because they reinvented themselves so often. Their stories have odd turns which speak not of one life, but of many that don't seem to match up, and of choices you'd think no one would actually make. When I was 12 years old, I lived by myself for a while. This was the mid-1970s in San Francisco, so the rules were a little different then, and yet not so different that me living alone made much sense. When I describe what happened, people tend to ask, "But how did you end up so..." They dance around the word normal. Realize it doesn't apply. And instead they say, "So nice." I'm not nice. I'm polite. Nice is a quality, and polite is a strategy. But I have ended up happy. Also, I've ended up something more unusual than that, autonomous. I have a good memory, but lately I've been looking for people who might know more, and I come up empty. Life in the 1970s led to a lot of bad luck and unintended consequence. Perversely, I'm relieved when I learn some people I wanted to talk to are dead. But then I find one man I don't actually want to, Peter Charming. He's almost invisible, but I'm good at research. He has no business licenses. He doesn't own property in his name. The house he lived in when I knew him turns out to have belonged to somebody else. And even his 1970s phone number is assigned to a different person in old directories. I can't find any criminal records, though those are difficult to get to the bottom of. The San Francisco Superior Court provides some sheet music in a way, and it's up to me to imagine the score. There are civil lawsuits. In some he's the defendant, and in other the plaintiff. One of them went on for 7 years and struggled all the way to trial twice. People leave San Francisco, but something always gets left behind, and usually it's gossip. I've mentioned his name to people who were there in that social circle, and it's like he never existed. I'm sure they met him, and I don't think they're lying when they say they don't remember. But he was of a time and a place that are gone now. It's like asking about a statue in a park, now the site of a high-rise. What happened to that old bronze bust? Don't you remember seeing it? His picture is in the society column of the San Francisco Chronicle in the late 1960s, and he looks young. He hasn't learned arrogance yet. Instead, he looks just shy of self-confidence, asking the camera to confirm that it sees him as handsome. He's an escort for women who are older. They have their own money, and my hunch is that when they stopped seeing Peter, they still had all of it, minus what they'd knowingly given him. That was before the 1970s, the time that was made for him. One person reacted to his name once. At a party sometime in the 1980s, I met a novelist whom I knew by reputation, a happy bullshit artist in the way of those beats who made careers in academic posts by writing out the ambiguity of whether they'd actually had Kerouac sleep on their couch. I was 22 and the novelist was in his 60s. He was talking to a beautiful woman who held her drink with both hands and who regarded him with suspicion, like he was about to offer her candy. As I was walking by, he brought me into the conversation, which I recognized as a gambit to make her reduce her grip on her glass to one hand, to let the other settle to her hip. "Excuse me," he said to me, "you look part English." "That's true. Is the other part Jewish?" I asked that as a full Jew myself. "It is. I've often thought the combination of English and Ashkenazi makes the most handsome man in the room. Don't you agree?" He asked this to the girl, and she was non-committal. "This fine woman," he said a moment later, "still hasn't decided to leave her husband for me, but I can't blame her. The question is whether she's going to expand her horizons or let them stay as they are," I said. He started to say something he prepared, but faltered. The conversation continued the way he was driving it as before, but his interest in her, obligatory as it already was complicated by this. I wasn't a chump. I'd been moderately funny, but I hadn't tried to compete. I was staying in the conversation to make him look good. That's a set of skills that develops in unusual circumstances. After the woman left for better prospects, he wanted to know about me. "How did you come to San Francisco?" he asked. I said my mother met a man at the Mark Hopkins Hotel. When that was all I said, he laughed. "What is it about the Mark Hopkins?" "She met a man who said he wanted to buy her a balloon and take her to Paris." I have to stop short my writer's memory, the desire to underline. I can't claim that he froze his wrist just as the drink was about to meet his lips. "I think I knew that man," he said. "You knew Peter Charming?" When he spoke again, it was with caution. "Do you know where he is still? Are you friends with his people?" "No, not anymore." It was unnerving to see a man like the novelist, whose identity pivoted on tall tales, sweep my eyes with conviction to see if I was telling the truth. How would he know if I were sincere? He asked my mother's name. I told him. He squinted. Vaguely, he thought he remembered her, but he wasn't sure. "Is your mother all right?" "No," I said. "I'm sorry." I'm never sure what to say when people have to say that about her. Finally, he said, "Charming was doing terrible things." "I know." "You knew?" He looked alarmed, as if I were aware of atrocities, but I had done nothing. "It was the 70s, he said, and some of us fell victim to improving ourselves in ways that turned out silly. It was a silly decade. People took advantage of that. Charming was bad. I heard bad things." "Like what?" "Why, slavery." I'd seen some things, but no, I haven't seen that. I wanted the conversation to last longer, but another woman walked by, as pretty as the last, and in mid-sentence the novelist waved her down, introducing us. He told her I was his son. As I shook hands with her, he made up a biography for me, the spawn of his second marriage. I was out from Cleveland. I was on the crew team at my college. Didn't I look just like him? As he spun the story, I went along with it. He said my mother, his ex-wife, was English, and he felt that the combination of English and Ashkenazi Jew was the most handsome on earth. Hadn't he done right by me? Wasn't I a wonder? Later, I phoned my mother to tell her much of this conversation. I treated our talks back then like trips down hallways with certain rooms under lock and key, but I didn't think about why I was so careful. I told her about the novelist introducing me as his son, which she found delightful. I didn't say he'd asked if she was okay or that I said she wasn't. He said Peter was involved in white slavery? I rarely speak with that uptick, but I was asking a question as subtle as I knew how. She answered in a way I would have said I felt nothing about. Oh, Peter. You know, it was just so hard to stay mad at him. He was just like a big kid. And there it was. That statement I felt nothing about, remembered for decades when I have long forgotten the details of birthdays and first kisses. How did I really feel? I felt a hot, dry, constricting tension that I did not allow dominion over me. I felt like I wanted the conversation to be over so I could tell people about it and read from their faces how I should feel too. Might it be disturbing that my mother had suggested human trafficking was forgivable, if not childlike? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I'm looking for confirmation. I look to you, you nod, I nod back. And how do you feel, Glenn, about a man you knew well perhaps being the worst sort of human being? With pride in my own detachment, I would say nothing. And upon your suggestion, perhaps unspoken, probably just a puzzled squint that I'm trained to look for, that someone more fully aware might feel something, I would think, no, I'm too strong for that. Nothing can touch me. And that reaction is what this story is about. For much of my life, there's been a circuitous pathway between when something happens and when I react. That gives the illusion of stillness, when in fact it's about trying to accommodate too much at once. I do not have feelings so much as I gauge what a loved one would want me to feel, and I tell myself about that. Peter Charming is part of the story, but really I'm looking for my mother, or what remains of her. There's not going to be redemption here, nor am I going to indict her as a monster. There's another way for those of us who can no longer love our mothers. I've learned compassion for her, what an old friend calls compassion from a distance. My mother's life has been a tragedy, but mine has not. And let's be honest here, my mother isn't the story either. I'd like to tell you about myself, which makes me want to apologize, the way my needing anything does. I place a high value on autonomy. When I was so young that my memories were hardly even meant to be permanent, 3 or 4 years old, my parents and I were watching television. I saw actors talking to camera. It impressed my parents. They said there was something sophisticated in admitting that the scene had an audience. So while I was hammering the flippers of my pinball machine or sinking shampoo bottles in the bathtub as if they were my great-grandfather's U-boat, I began talking to myself. I knew it wasn't real, but it was as vivid as the adventures I gave my stuffed kangaroo. When I was alone in a room, I was never alone, for there was an audience I was meant to entertain. And after I was put to bed, time and again, my mother or father had to come into the room to tell me to be quiet, because I was telling the events of the day to my invisible confederates, whom I loved for giving me a purpose. There was a rule I hewed to like it was superstition. In bed, lights out, I had to only talk until I described my day well enough that it felt true. There was a comforting assurance that if I told the story right, I could finally go to sleep, and that feeling has never left me. Now, I tell myself that if what I say here is true, I will be complete, and that is what I'm looking for too.